And welcome everybody to our webinar on using stories in the history classroom. I'm Christine Counsell and I'm series editor for Changing Histories. Hugh, do you want to just introduce yourself quickly?
I'm Hugh Richards. I'm a head of history at a secondary school in York.
So we're looking after you this evening, and this session is Hugh's session. It's not me. I'm just here to introduce him. And this afternoon's webinar is called Using Stories in the History Classroom. I'm just going to say a tiny little bit about the context of who we are and why we're doing this and what it's all for, and just set the scene really for Hugh's session. Then I shall hand over to Hugh, and then at the end of the afternoon, at the end of the session, we will be happy to take some questions, which we'll probably take in the chat. So, tiny little bit of context in case you're wondering, who are these people? Where has this webinar come from? Oh, first of all, I wonder if we could just make sure everybody could mute. Thank you very much. And then we don't have to do that terribly rude thing of muting you all at our end. Thank you so much. So we are a group of people who a few years ago decided that we really needed to do something different with history resourcing. We felt we wanted a resource which reflected what we knew was the very best practice that we had seen, that we'd practiced ourselves. We are a group of history teachers, former history teachers, and among them history educators, history teacher educators, former history teacher educators, people who have worked in history education pretty much all their careers. And we also work very closely with academic historians. And we felt concerned, as so many people did, so many perhaps as you have done. I wonder if you could just remember to mute if you've just joined us. Thank you. Hugh, perhaps you could be on mute duty. So we felt that we wanted to produce a resource which did a number of things. We wanted to make sure that we
Christine, sorry, that muting has also muted you, which hasn't helped.
muted everybody, including me, right? So
there we go, we're good.
Teething problems here to start with. I'll start again, don't worry. So if you've just joined us, I'm just giving a few quick words of introduction here to who we are and what this is all about. We felt, a large group of us a few years ago, that we really wanted to produce a different sort of resource for history teachers, the kind of resource that we had always wanted, one that was packed with rich stories, one that was not squeamish about giving children enough information, but in the form of really rich and well-written accounts. We feel that so often children are given really poor writing, and instead of being given lively accounts or accounts that are varied in their prose and in their style or appropriate to the type of argument or narrative that's being advanced, that children are often just given sort of fairly isolated propositions and fairly dry prose. We wanted to give them the kind of richer text that we had always striven for in our own classrooms and in the classrooms of those history teachers too that we trained. We also wanted a resource that was much, much closer to the work of academic scholars. We wanted to make sure that the history that we read by real historians is reflected in the way we write, not just by bolting on bits of scholarship. So, here's a bit of scholarship, here's a story, but really feeding into our very choice of content, our choice of inquiry questions, our flow, our overall planning. So our goal then was to try to create a resource that reflected what we know, not only in our own classrooms, but in those of many others, was strong practice, and that really helped everybody to raise their game. So we've been doing that for 4 years. We're a very large group, and we're working closely with numerous academic historians to whom we're very indebted. We also wanted to create a resource that was up to date in terms of the way in which modern scholarship addresses the diversity of the past and the diversity of those who study the past, which again perhaps had been lacking. So that's another key dimension in what we're trying to do. And finally, I think we wanted to create a resource that was systematic, that built over time, that did something really thorough and rich and coherent in year 7, on which children could build in year 8 and year 9. So this just then, by way of very brief introduction, these are the 3 books that we decided we would write. The first one, Connected Worlds, is out, and Hugh will be using some of his stories from that book. The second one, Expanding Worlds, I am getting very close to production now, and will soon be out. It'll be out this year. And just at the bottom, I will list the team, the full team, to whom we are all very, very indebted, a team of authors, and also a community of practicing history teachers who have produced an accompanying resource called Boost, which supplies all the sort of additional practical stuff that you might need, everything from PowerPoints and assessments to just teachers chatting about how they do it in the classroom. And talking of teachers chatting about how they do it in the classroom, it was that made us decide that we wanted to do these webinars, well, we've done 3 so far, but we've got more to come, a long series of webinars, because we were very conscious, and we've been made increasingly conscious, that there's quite a gulf in this country between those teachers who are fortunate enough to have had outstanding initial teacher training, teachers who, when they first started to teach, either because they were on a great course that was history specific, or perhaps because they had a great mentor, and it might be just the accident of that, or they landed in a wonderful department, and those teachers who perhaps didn't, through no fault of their own, have that fantastic start. So we've got some teachers in the country who really know how to use story, who have had a history specific teacher training course of at least 30 days or more on their initial teacher training year of intensive history specific training, backed up and integrated with rich history led training in school. And they know how to use stories. They were introduced to working with historical scholarship. Historical scholarship crops up every single session. They're used to thinking through what's a rigorous inquiry question and what isn't, and how you might weave a sequence of lessons together to really sing and to really drive at that governing disciplinary question. And there are many in the country who have not been fortunate enough to have had that excellent foundation, that excellent training, that very history specific training. So we thought, as well as a resource, a series of textbooks, and the Boost resources to accompany it, we thought, let's do a series of free webinars that anyone can come to, regardless of the textbooks, which bit by bit sets out some really practical tips of what great practice can look like, of how you can be very ambitious, draw all children in to rich, highly scholarly and very coherent history. So we have done, I might just go back to that other slide, we have done a series of webinars. We're now on our 3rd. I did an introductory webinar. And I talked a lot about the purpose of using stories and the importance of diverse voices in our history teaching, and the role of text, the critical role of text, and why so many great history teachers are having such success with rich extended text with the full attainment range. So I did that in the first webinar. Then Paula Worth built on that, and she really challenged in her session on sources the really problematical practice that you see if you're dependent on GCSE questions for sources. And she showed how we can make sure that we're building from the ground up with teaching strong evidential thinking, making sources enormously rewarding, absolutely fascinating, and nothing to do with GCSE questions, while at the same time preparing beautifully for GCSE because it's properly teaching children about evidential thinking and looking at longer sources, richer sources, more varied and diverse sources. So that was what we chose to focus the second webinar on. And then we thought another major priority was actually sharing how you use stories in the classroom. It's all very well supplying a resource with nice, rich, varied, diverse stories, but what do you do with them? How do you bring children to the point where they are ready and keen to listen to them and to read them? What's their role in history education? So Hugh Richard, master storyteller, who's written quite a bit for our books, and he's been very active in our Boost resources, very kindly agreed to do the 3rd one. Those are just the first 3. It's a long series. We've got numerous people lined up to do the subsequent webinars, but we're on our 3rd, and we put QR codes there on this slide. So if you're thinking, oh, I'd quite like to have gone to Paula's on sources, or I'd like to have gone to the introductory one, stories, voices and text, then you can register for those simply by using those QR codes. And Hugh, you're going to put this slide up at the end again, aren't you? So people will have another chance if you haven't had a chance now. And for now, I am going to hand over to Hugh. So, are you sitting comfortably? Over to you, Hugh.
Okay, thank you very much for kind introduction. I will share my screen now and we will get going. So, there we are. So yes, I'm Hugh. I thought I might start with a little bit of context beyond sort of what I'm doing with the Changing Histories project, because this is a slightly warped Google Earth strange picture of my school, but you can see it. It looks like it's been hit by a major atomic bomb, but it's not that bad. I teach at a comprehensive school in York, a fully comprehensive school. We draw from the full range of socioeconomic backgrounds. We have students who are the daughters of professors at York University, and we have people from some of the most entrenched poverty in the city on some of the estates in our catchment area. And I suppose part of what I'm trying to do today is explain to you how we've made this work in a real school. We've been lucky to be able to trial Changing Histories for a while now, and been using it in the classroom and feeding back to the author team and feeding back to Christine about how they're going. And it's been really exciting to work on this. And we started building stories across our curriculum at Key Stage 4 and 5 as well. And we've started to think about how strong characters and dramatic events and narrative and extended text can have a role to play across our curriculum. Now, these aren't just sort of theoretical things that sound nice but don't actually work. You know, they only work with spherical students in a laboratory vacuum, right? These work in a real school. And if I'm honest, like, I can't really imagine myself teaching without them again. There's not many things in my pedagogy that I think, you know what, I can't imagine myself teaching history without these things. But stories are kind of quite integral now to how I teach, and it's really hard to imagine not doing that. So I think I want to try and share with you today a little bit about how I learned to teach these stories in the classroom, and also a little bit about why I'm doing that and how we can kind of make these stories work in different scales and different curriculum places. So I think I'll start with just a little bit on why we're telling stories. Now, Christine's done some amazing work in the first webinar to discuss why stories have such a place to sort of in our curriculums and a role to play in our classrooms. But for us, we found it really nicely draws students into the past. So attention is currency, and we find ourselves fighting to gain it and sometimes battling to sustain it. And there's kind of much debate about prioritizing the efficient communication of knowledge versus making teaching engaging. But a well-written story we've found does both, which is very, very exciting. So when they've come in from PE or chemistry or a maths test or a difficult lunchtime or whatever it is, we found that sort of bringing them back to the story has been the best way to get their brains into history mode and to get them relocated back into the study of the past or the topic we've been studying. But we're doing it in quite a compelling, quite an immersive way. And they have to imagine the past, right? The past is an imagined space, and stories help them imagine it, often on the level of a single human. And that sort of really helps them try and picture what's happened in the world before they've existed. And fundamentally, before they can get onto the more sophisticated analysis of the past, they do need to know the what of what's happened. They also need to be curious about it. We find that the students want to know what happens to the characters next. They consume a lot of media where characters are a huge part of it. They watch series on Netflix or wherever, and they get invested in characters. And we found that as a really important vehicle for moving them forward in their history knowledge. And we'll talk a bit more later about how we make sure that effect can be maximized across different lessons. But we've also found it's kind of memorable, and that's linked to that, because they sort of hang their knowledge of a period around the characters and the events that character is encountering or sort of having agency in. So we find that their knowledge of periods and events is sort of hooked onto that person. Now, for us, so they'll say to us, oh, is that the guy who did this, and wasn't there this going on and that going on? And they'll remember it around a particular individual. Now, our curriculum is not the paper it's written on. It's not the lovely curriculum map or whatever, the intention document. It's what is left, what residue is left in our students' heads at the end of Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4 or Key Stage 5, whenever they end their history journey. That residue that's left, that's how I define our curriculum. Everything else is just intention, it's just hope. So it's really important that the stories kind of helped us achieve this aim. They helped us really embed that and encode that information in our students' brains. And there's good science behind this. There's lots of cognitive science that shows how stories are really well-told stories are really good at encoding new information into brains. And they have powerful effects. They can release different hormones in the brain. So, you know, you can have a dopamine release in response to an emotionally charged situation, or cortisol if there's conflict going on. You've got these powerful hormones moving around in the brain, and they're able to these endorphins and things are able to really sculpt how the memory works. They're able to make it a little bit more plastic, perhaps, and they allow encoding to happen more easily. When there's a satisfying resolution to a story or an episode, you get this endorphin release. And that's why children love stories so much. And we all do, actually, all the way through our lives. So we talk about retrieval practice a lot, but actually without that perfectly strong encoding at the beginning, we're kind of fishing in an empty pond with retrieval practice. We need to make sure that we've got something to retrieve. And we found that stories have been really, really helpful. And all of this makes it great fun to teach. There are things I love doing with stories. I'll tell you a bit later on about trying to get students to read on all by themselves. So I'll start reading them a story, I'll stop at a cliffhanger, and I'll just let it hang in the air. And then they just can't help themselves but start reading. And that's absolutely magic. So I'm hoping that what I can show you today is as much about that magic as it is about the kind of memory. It's as much about the hard, like changing the long-term memories of our students' side of learning, as much as it is the magic of classroom practice when it's at its absolute best. So there's kind of 4 areas that I want to talk about, how we make this magic happen. I want to explore how we read stories really well, what good reading will look like, and that seems like a kind of difficult thing to think about, perhaps, not something we think about very often, but how we read stories, there's a lot to unpack there. I want us to make sure that the single lesson stories that we tell sort of pack a lot of curricular punch. And I'm also going to explore a little bit about how we can tell a story that spans several lessons that can be delivered to really maximum effect. So how can we keep a story running across 5 or 6 lessons when they have got all of these competing things for their attention, to chemistry here and MFL there and PE there, and how do we manage to keep that thread of a story going when they come back and they drop back in for an hour of history or whatever. And finally, I want to talk about the idea of takeaways and how that improves the story-led teaching and the assessment that goes with it, to try and make sure that we're using these things as best we can. So we're going to start with how we can read stories in the classroom, and we'll move on from there. Now, one of the main ways I do that is teacher reading. But before I talk to you a bit about that, I think it's important to emphasize there's no one-size-fits-all approach here, and how you read the stories will vary. Mine vary compared to other colleagues in my department, and it varies even with the group I'm teaching. If I've got a higher ability group, perhaps I might do more of a different type of reading to one of our literacy nurture groups. We tell the same story, but we might read it slightly differently. And before I go further, I should also acknowledge that some of this has just been CPD that I have taken from the brilliant Elizabeth Carr, who has contributed some work on reading to those boost resources that Christine mentioned. So that's well worth a look. I mean, there's lots of things in there about techniques and methods for reading in the classroom. But basically what I'm trying to achieve is to get all the students to read as confidently as they can. And we're going to do that with different levels of independence. So there's a range of strategies we can use. And the first one I think about is teacher reading aloud. So when I read it, why am I reading a story aloud to a class? Normally, but not always, normally they're reading along with me. And so what we're doing here is we're modeling pronunciation of unfamiliar words. And actually, I model the struggle with this. If there's a word I'm not very confident with, or I don't really know how to pronounce, or I do, but I'm going to act this out a little bit. I say, right, I need to slow down and think about how I pronounce this. Oh, I'm not really good at pronouncing this. We'll have a go. And just showing that that's okay to grapple with that when you're reading. But also then they do have the example of an expert, a fluent reader for them to kind of mimic when they take turns with their reading. So that is really beneficial. And there are other things going on here, I think, as well. So we do build their literacy in those ways and their confidence and their fluency, because actually they do need to practice reading. And they do actually need to practice reading aloud. And there's a lot there that I think they can be they don't talk as much as they used to, students. I think they do a lot more kind of typing their communications between each other with texts and whatever. And actually there's a lot to be said here for talking in front of other human beings in the same room as you. And they need to practice that, I reckon. And this is a really good way to do that. But there's lots of history content there that I can do. So if I need to stop and clarify new vocabulary, I can do that if I'm reading the story. I can add emphasis to the takeaways that I want them to focus on. And I'll show you a bit of that later on. And I can also give the students space to imagine the scene. So they don't have to spend their time figuring out individual words, particularly our intervention groups, our literacy intervention groups. They really need a little bit of time and space to imagine the history without getting stuck all of the time on the language. We do get them to read aloud. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. But there is a lot to be said for giving them a little bit of space to let the history live in their minds and the story to advance, and for them to imagine the world. And I think that's really powerful as a way to deliver history content. And the last thing is a bit of classroom magic, right? I love it that we have smooth and immersive storytelling. I love that we have pace and tone and humanity, and we can build all of those things in as history teachers. And Christine and I will demonstrate that with some of our reading today. We can have captivating characters, we can have dramatic situations, and we can convey all of that through our tone, through our reading. And the last thing I've kind of tacked on the bottom there is I think reading something together creates a classroom community. I think they get invested in the story as a whole. They take sides of different characters. They sort of react to it and respond to it as a class. And it's hard for me to pin that down, and it's never going to be the subject of a research paper, and it's never going to be something that I can evidence or prove. But actually, I think we know it when we see it, don't we? I think we've all been in lessons, we've all taught lessons where you have that level of magic in a way that perhaps you don't in all lessons. And when it happens, it's just brilliant. And I think when we found using stories, we found that has happened quite a lot. So let's give you an example of what teacher reading aloud might look like. This is one story where I do like to read it aloud, partly because I do teach the tutors at A level, and I like to pause it here and there and add a little nugget. It does get embellished a little bit, and that's different to other teachers in my department. So some of them don't teach that course at A level, and they just work with the text exactly as it is. But I read this one aloud, and I think it's totally fine that variance exists. I mean, this is a tool, right? It's not necessarily a script. I think it can be something which we use as part of a repertoire of teaching, even when the lesson is mostly the story. Now, it's a 3-page story. I'll show you that in just a moment. We do this story, I think it's important to emphasize, we do this story with year 7 in a single lesson. And to achieve that, most of my colleagues use a teacher read aloud method for this, because the other thing about teacher read aloud is it does make the story flow through quicker, and you can get some ground covered if you're trying to get an overview. This is a story summary, which the textbooks use to cover some ground in a kind of overview way, which is sort of without going into the depth that you might in an inquiry chapter. Now, excitingly, today, we're going to hear it as the author intended it, because Christine's going to read it for us. She's very kindly offered to read a short section of this story. And what I hope you can imagine is that year 7 are finding this really interesting. They're going to find the characters compelling, and they can picture the story in their heads. But also we as teachers can imagine this happening in our classroom. The last thing to say about the story summaries, I'll mention it again in a bit, is these are really good ways into this. If you're not sure about using these stories in your classroom and you want to experiment with it, then starting with a story summary is a really, really powerful way to do that, because you're just going to invest a single lesson, and you're going to have a play with reading aloud, or you're going to have a play with them reading it, and you can ask them their reactions to it, and you can take it from there. So I'm going to hand over to Christine, and she's going to read us a little bit from this story summary, which is a 3-page one. Meanwhile in England, Henry VIII breaks with Rome.
Thanks, Hugh. And I'll give a tiny bit of context, as you kindly given it away that I was the author of it. But as Hugh mentioned their story summaries, one of the things that we do in these books is something I think that has emerged in many history teachers' practice. I know I started doing it when I was a head of history, which is that most of the time you're teaching with inquiries, maybe 4, 5, 6 lessons linked up around a single inquiry question through which you're teaching some disciplinary thinking. But there's sometimes when, in order to teach all the rich history you want to connect up, you need just to do certain things more quickly. You need to, shall we say, microwave some topics rather than slow cook them. And if you really are wanting, and we've achieved it with these books, if you're wanting to make sure you do teach plenty of African history, Asian history, American history, get that global breadth, get cultural breadth and diversity, then you've got to make some hard choices. So one of the hard choices we made with these books was to do a classic story, which is vital. I think children have to understand this. The Henry VIII breaks with Rome. What a crucial story. They've got to understand that to grasp numerous things, such as the mingled political and religious origins of all sorts of institutions in this country. So I think it would be a poor history curriculum if you weren't doing Henry VIII's break with Rome. But we've already done the Reformation in Europe, on the continent, in more depth. We've done Martin Luther. We've done a great deal of other more European content on religion in more depth. So we chose to do Henry VIII and the break with Rome speedily. So you could do it in 1, maybe 2 lessons at the most as a story with some discussion built around it. And then I had to make a decision. How was I going to do this in a fresh way? Because we've all got stuff on Henry VIII on our shelves. And I thought, I know, I'm going to do it all through the lens of Catherine of Aragon. So she was the person that I researched, and I decided just to build fascination with Catherine of Aragon. And I learned a few things. Maybe there'll be the odd thing here that you won't know as well. And I certainly found that in my own practice, that the children are just hooked in instantly by this remarkable woman, especially if we get to know her when she's young, not when, everything starts unraveling later. So I'll just have a little read. Hugh, do you want to put up the bits? I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I'm just going to get going at the beginning. When the exhausted, grief-stricken Henry VII died in 1509, a lively, handsome 17-year-old came to the throne. This was Henry VIII. He was a great linguist and an enthusiastic scholar. He had read many works of science, literature, philosophy, and theology in Latin. An impressive sportsman, he enjoyed wrestling and double-axe fighting, became a dab hand at archery and fencing, and excelled at jousting. Great things were expected of Henry. His energy, his fearlessness on horseback, and his great learning all boded well for a glorious reign by a dynamic king. Henry's marriage, too, boded well. Just weeks before coming to the throne, Henry had married his dead brother's wife. This was the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, whose first wedding featured in chapter 20. I'm now going to break all the rules and just mention the fact that the children already know about this wedding. We wouldn't interrupt the story in the way. This extraordinary wedding of Catherine to Arthur, which was like a carnival. It was, the event of all events, and there were plays, processions, and pageants all through London. And we get the children enthralled by this white satined, gold headdressed princess from Spain. So the children have already encountered this woman. That's part of the building. Right, back to the story. Everyone, especially Catherine and Henry, assumed that children would follow, including a son and heir. Catherine had even chosen a symbol of fertility, the pomegranate, as her personal badge. To the Tudor dynasty, marriage to Catherine of Aragon brought prestige. A princess from mighty Spain was a great prize, and Henry adored her. She was charming, intelligent, and well-read, described by sources as very pretty, with copper gold hair tumbling to her knees. She seems to have entranced her new husband, who often invited guests to admire her beauty. By the 1st of November 1509, Henry had news for Catherine's father, the King of Spain. Your daughter, our Serene Highness the Queen, our dearest consort, has conceived in her womb a living child, and is right heavy therewith, which we signify to your Majesty for the great joy thereof that we take, and the exultation of our whole realm. But the child was stillborn. During her first 9 years as queen, Catherine had 5 more pregnancies. Only 2 babies were born alive. Only one lived, a daughter, Mary. Catherine was popular. Admired early for adapting well to English royal life, she was admired even more for her dignity and courage during so many miscarriages and stillbirths. Catherine was admired too for deep religious devotion and great learning. A lively communicator, her energy shined through in her letters. Catherine was also busy. She ran her own estates and was involved in great affairs of state. For 5 years, she acted as England's Spanish ambassador. Growing up in Spain, she had learned from watching her parents manage war and diplomacy. In 1513, aged 27, Catherine took command of England while Henry waged war in France. When Scotland declared war on England, Catherine relished the chance to take charge. In a letter in August 1513, she remarked, "We are all very glad to be busy with the Scots. My heart is very good to it." As well as adopting a woman's more traditional role in warfare, "I am horribly busy with making standards, banners, and badges," she wrote. She now led the war against Scotland. She organised troops, weapons, ships, and supplies. On horseback, she led the troops north as far as Warwick.
Thank you very much, Christine. That was wonderful reading as always. Now, Christine didn't know I was doing this, but what I actually did there was time how long she spent reading the story. Now, as you can see, we got to here about halfway, just under halfway through this story, and it took 3 minutes and 56 seconds of reading. And I think the efficiency of that is really appealing. I feel like we know Catherine, I feel like we know Henry, I feel like we know this young royal couple in love trying to have children. And if you're worrying, because I think it's easy to sit there, if you haven't had a go at this, it's quite easy to sit there and worry and go, oh, my students aren't going to know about archery, fencing, jousting, right? I think they'll understand what double-handed axe fighting is, but yeah, there might be some words in there that we're thinking, oh, like, is a scholar going to trip them up? Well, you have plenty of time. You can do this in a lesson. You have plenty of time. That was just under 4 minutes. You can stop after each paragraph if you want, and you can ask them questions. You can ask them to turn and discuss things quickly. What does this mean? What does that mean? Oh, what's interesting? What's happened there? How has the story moved forward there? Oh, Catherine's been at war. What's interesting about that? Is that what we have expected of a queen? All of these kinds of things. How does this compare to other monarchs we've studied? You can do lots and lots of that kind of questioning work in and around this story. The story drives the lesson forward, but it is a tool. It's not a script. And you have time to explore it with the students. And it's an incredibly efficient way of learning an awful lot of stuff. So hopefully you can see how you can hit some curricular goals very efficiently, but you also get a flavor of the world that these two lived in. You get a sense of what they might be doing. They're writing letters to each other. You build up that just in the background, that sense of period that is so important for the students to get. And you can see there's a subhead there that says copying the German princes. Well, we're going to connect this story into other things that we already know about. So this is a really helpful way of thinking about story and what you can do with it. But it's worth us reading bits of it aloud just to show you that in the course of 4 or 5 minutes, you could read this whole thing through in 15 minutes maximum. So there is plenty of space around that for discussion, for recording little bits if you want them to write stuff down, for even responding to certain questions you want in longer form, like sentences or paragraphs. They can do loads of work with this very, very efficiently. So there is a lot to be said for that. But that hopefully the other thing you got from that is a sense of what the teacher reading aloud might look like. And you can see the benefit there. Christine put an emphasis on the word, she adored him. And I think you can just notice that by slowing down on that word for just a beat longer, you can conjure up a loving couple. And that's going to add weight to the break from Rome, because Henry this is going to fall apart. This loving marriage is going to fall apart. So I think that hopefully you see some of the power of teacher reading. It's nice and fluent. It's nice and immersive. The story moves along. But that's not to say that you necessarily read it through all at the same time, because you have plenty of time to unpick that text with the students if you want to. Something I like to do sometimes is I might read that all myself, but I might find a decent Henry VIII impersonator in year 7 who wants to read out that letter from him, so that we get a sense of a different voice when we're using his words directly. There's lots of different things you can do to mix up the teacher reading aloud format, but it has real potential. And I'll show you a bit more when I read out a bit of the Josiah Wedgwood story from book 2 later on. So we have, there we go, let's move on. We have a thinking there about teachers reading, but obviously I want my students to become more confident with their own reading and reading aloud to groups of peers. That social dynamic is really important. And the main way I do this is I allocate sections of text to different pupils. And there's nothing revolutionary about that. And I encourage them to read with drama and emphasis, copying my modeling. And in most cases, they've really gone for this. Year 7 absolutely adore putting drama into their reading. They've done loads of practice of it at primary school. And at secondary, we kind of forget that and they kind of drone. But the history gets lost if they kind of drone. So I make sure that I'm saying them, you've just read about a war breaking out and you've told me it as if you're going down to the shop, right? Can we get this a bit more dramatic? And they have another go. And I sometimes take them back for a paragraph to make it much more dramatic. Now, there is some evidence actually that them reading aloud to each other helps their memory of the story, because they remember when Sam read something dramatically and they think, well, that was funny, or they thought it was it caught their imaginations. Sometimes we do use a popcorn style of reading where I start them reading, and then I'll say a name at the end of a sentence, and the voice will move to another student. Now I take SEND into this, and I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a moment. But some read a whole paragraph, others will just read a sentence. Sometimes I photocopy the page of the textbook and I mark on it who's going to read what, and so I can plan for different students with different levels of confidence in reading, where there might be trickier words to sound out or an easier section. It doesn't take me very long to do that. And because so much of the planning is done already in the form of the text, a lot of my planning time can be thinking really hard about which students are going to do what within this phase. Now, my favorite is probably, I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but when it does happen, it's just magic. And this is where as I said earlier, I pause the reading at a moment of drama and they just can't help themselves, right? They just have to read on. I love in the book, if you have the book, you'll be able to notice this. Sometimes the points of drama are at the page break as well. So you get this wonderful moment where you just hear the pages turning and you just allow it to happen. And it's absolutely fabulous. So I call that pause and read on, but it's amazing to see the storytelling gripping the students. And you know, the couple that don't, I can just kind of say, you can read on, and they'll carry on. And it's really nice to see them sneaking a peek over the page. Now, there are times I don't want them to read. There might be something sensitive or controversial that I really need to do myself to add the gravitas that it needs, or to add the sense of drama or the sense of disaster or whatever it is that I'm trying to convey. Sometimes we have big paragraphs where there's quite a few foreign names or foreign language words, and actually I'd rather pronounce them myself to model that than ask a student and put it on a student to carry that for us. So sometimes the delivery matters, and actually I will read it myself for those reasons. But for most of the time, I find that the students are very happy to read small sections of this. And it is horses for courses. You know, I'd say it's probably a 50-50 split between how much I read and how much they read. Now, I did say that I'd move on to thinking about some SEND students and some lower starter students. The first thing I'd say is the text is actually really, really helpful. We've done quite a lot of department meeting work on using these texts with a fully mixed ability range. And we've thought about making sure how the approach will land with all of those students. And trust me when I say that I would not use it if it didn't. I don't think I would use a pedagogy that isn't going to work with every student in the room somehow. So perhaps counterintuitively, I think reading the text is more effective for these students than telling a story or using a documentary video or something. We have the text to refer back to is the first thing I would say, is that if I'm asking them to record something after reading it, I've told the story, right, can we record a few things we've noticed? I can say to them, go back to this paragraph or that paragraph and have a little read of that again, or jog your memory, and they can go back to it. So for those for whom working memory is a problem, actually they can go back to that paragraph. Similarly, we can just stop every single paragraph and take the thing we want. We can go it through chunk by chunk a little bit more. That's absolutely fine. And we can see the words spelt on a page. I think that really helps with their spelling. We can see the phrases that the storytellers use. That really helps with their vocabulary development. And if a student is struggling to read, then there's a few techniques I do use. For example, if they struggle to pronounce a word, we will stop and all pronounce it as a class. So I will say, okay, can we say industrialization? And the whole class then goes industrialization chorally back to me. They're really used to doing this at primary school, and they're absolutely fine with it. What that does is it puts our invisible class community arms around that student and goes, we're all going to struggle with this. We'll all join you in pronouncing it correctly. And actually, that really helps them build their confidence. I do this at GCSE. I do this at A level. I had my whole of year 12 saying transubstantiation to me yesterday. And that's fine. The other thing I would say is if you can, I think lingering on the images is really, really helpful. So can you see what, look at this image. Can you see where this is happening? What do you notice about that? Can you imagine if? And because you can move the storytelling through quite briskly in places like Christine has just done for us, you can actually spend some time looking at these images. I tend to put on the whiteboard, all I have is big full slide images, which I can direct their attention to when I want them to, and they can have a look at it, and it adds a little bit, and I can say, can we see this? Can we see that? And then return the attention to the story. And I think, we don't have too many split attention issues, that they know where they're focusing, but lingering on images is a really powerful way to build their sense of what's happening in the story. We do plan it carefully. We do, when we use it for these literacy nurture groups that we have in Key Stage 3, I have a colleague who insists that every student reads at least a sentence every lesson. And since doing that, he's found that most of them are reading 3 or 4 sentences, or they're reading whole paragraphs or whole chunks. And just by going, do you know what? The way we participate in history, part of how we participate in history, is we have a go at reading. It's been really powerful, and it's become a norm in that classroom, and it's really good to see. And they ask for more, they're asking to take it on because they're finding joy in this reading themselves. And to me, that's really important for these students. I think even more so, and maybe close your ears. I realize I'm talking to a lot of history teachers right now, but even more so than learning the history, I think that confidence in their own reading is a very, very important part of their life opportunities. So that's really crucial, and history does provide an opportunity for them to have a go at that. I think there is an element of forewarned is forearmed. I tell them which paragraph they're going to read, and they can have a little moment to sit and read and check over it. And I say to the class, just quiet, let's have some respect for the readers, let's give them a moment. They might ask me the odd word, and I might do that choral thing with the odd word. And getting this right really helps those students with some anxiety or some concerns around that kind of social and emotional side of learning. So I've had parents kind of telling me that the student regards that bit of reading as their major achievement for the day. I've had parents come and say, they read a little bit of your story about Alexios today, and they absolutely loved it. And just that sense of, wow, okay, for that student, that reading is really important, and they're very proud of it. And the last point is obvious, isn't it? If we don't do this, who will? They're not accessing, a lot of them, I don't mean all of our students, but they're often not accessing extended texts at home. A lot of media is delivered to them in different formats. And I think we have an opportunity to kind of counter that with compelling and fascinating and exciting stories, but we're sneaking in a lot of literacy practice too. And that's no bad thing. Okay, if we move on now to how we might use these single lesson stories a little bit more. There's one other one I'd like to talk to you about, and that's one we use with Year 7. So just like the Henry VII one, we use one on Norman Sicily. So Year 7 begin their story in Norman England. And we begin with Yorkshire monasteries, because those Yorkshire monasteries and saints, that's a story, that's a language, that's a landscape. That's a history that infuses street names and places and sites. They've all been to Whitby, they've had fish and chips, they've looked up at the building on top of the cliffs and wondered what's gone on there. And so we do a little unit on the monasteries. But then I want to get moving. They've got further into Year 7. They've kind of settled in a little bit. We're 4, 5, 6 weeks in. We've done a chunk of Norman England. Some of them have even stopped wearing the big Ninja Turtle backpacks by this point, and they're kind of ready to do a bit more. And I want to take them further afield. Let's get to the Byzantine Empire, for example. Now, this isn't the sequence of things that happen in the books. And the better we get at using these books, I think the more we're going to use from them. So it might well be that we actually do start them in the Mediterranean a bit earlier, as the book does. But again, as a head of department, rolling this out, I found that rolling it out in stages has really helped grow my team's confidence with this. So starting with the smaller stories and then the bigger ones, and we're getting to a point now where we're going to use more and more and more of this. But I've taken that slowly. But yeah, how do I get from Yorkshire monasteries to the Byzantine Empire? Well, I want to join in battle of Alexios I in before the First Crusade. I want us to join Mansa Musa and the Empire of Mali. I want us to move our horizons and lift that a little bit. But to reach it, we need that stepping stone. And so we use Norman Sicily. For one lesson, we dash off to Norman Sicily and have a look at what's going on. And we start to world build in a broader sense. We progress the narrative, but we construct a really well-organized, connected medieval world. And so with that curricular ambition in place, what does it look like in a lesson? Well, these are some of the big themes that we start developing in Year 7. And I asked them, what do you know about medieval power and religion and society? And they say, well, kings are in charge. It's a Christian world. And society is rural, agricultural. People make their money on farms. And this is fine because we've been in Bourne, right? We've been in a small village in medieval England. We've galloped off to York for a little bit, but they're kind of used to medieval life in England. And what I love about this image, by the way, the reason I chose this image is it looks exactly like some of the monastery images that we've used in our earlier studies. So I'm kind of just subtly pushing that direction. And occasionally they notice the palm trees and go, hang on. And that's great fun. So that's our starter. That's where we begin. And what I then do is I then bring them to Sicily, right? And you can see here how the Sicily story unpacks and moves us forward. It takes some concepts that they've been building, and it moves us forward. And I'm going to do a little bit of my own teacher reading now to again model that for you guys and show you what that looks like. But I want to get you a sense of what's magical about this story that's been written by Tim and Christine. And I mean, if you are nervous about reading these stories, I can understand that. But listen, if I can do it with Christine actually listening to me doing it right now, then you guys can do it with Year 7, I promise. So here we go, with apologies to the author who is listening to me. If you stand on this high fort on Sicily's coast, you can see Italy. In the 12th century, ships easily sailed the calm waters of the Mediterranean to Italian cities, such as Venice or Rome. Glance at the map on page 44, and you'll see Sicily's closeness to other shores of the Mediterranean too. A journey south would bring you swiftly to Muslim North Africa. Head east, and you could sail right into Constantinople's harbour. Sicily was central in the connected worlds of medieval Europe, Asia, and Africa. But it was also unique. Here, on this tiny island, these connected worlds existed very close together indeed. The marble gravestone on this page was made in 1149. The woman buried in the grave was called Anna. Her son had the gravestone made. Look closely, and you will see writing in 4 different scripts. What can we see, Year 7? Can you see any different scripts? Do you recognize any of them? I'm just going to pause and come out of this for a moment. The magic of when one of our students from a Middle Eastern background spots the Arabic is just remarkable. They absolutely love the fact that they're seeing something that's so familiar to them, but they virtually never see in school. It's absolutely marvelous. Anyway, I then talk them through it. Again, staying back into the text now. On the left, we see Latin, the language of ancient Rome. In the 12th century, Western Christians still used Latin in religious services, in laws, and in the business of government. On the right, Greek, the language of the Byzantine Christians. At the bottom, Arabic, the language of the Muslim peoples. And at the top, more Arabic, but not in the Arabic alphabet. This is the Hebrew alphabet, understood by many Jewish people. In fact, Jewish and Muslim people had lived together in Sicily for so long that most Jewish people spoke both Arabic and Hebrew. And then I tend to pause, and the reflection question I start to ask now is, okay, well, what does this gravestone tell us? And then realize that Anna is connected to all these different people, and her son wants all these different people to recognize her gravestone and to recognize the information about her and to remember her. And therefore, she herself is connected to all of these different people. She has these social connections, and we're part of an integrated community. I'll pick up the story again. During parts of the 12th century, Muslims, Jewish people, and both types of Christian all lived and worked together peacefully in Sicily. We don't know which group Anna belonged to, but her son clearly wanted different groups to read about her. Many of these peoples kept their own traditions. By the time Anna's gravestone was made in 1149, Sicily's rulers allowed each community to practice its religion freely and run its own course. Okay, so then there's another section of the story which helps you look around the incredible royal chapel in Palermo. I won't go there because I want to show you a little bit of the curricular connection thing. So the next page of the story, we ask this question: what were the Normans doing in Italy? We need, because as part of looking at the church, we should say this, that the king who built the chapel in Palermo was a Norman. And suddenly their ears prick up and go, hang on, I thought Normans were Northern European beasts. All right, and we've now found them. We've stumbled across them, tripped up over some Normans in a golden Christian church in Palermo. Right, what were the Normans doing in Italy? We need to go back in time to find out. These Northmen, Vikings, had settled in northern France in the 10th century. See, these Northmen had become known as Normans. By the 11th century, Normans were spreading all over Europe. The first Normans to leave Normandy had been pilgrims visiting holy sites in Italy. These Normans were also skilled warriors. They soon found work as soldiers in the wars between groups of Western Christians, Byzantine Christians, and Muslims. All these groups fought each other for control of Italy. The Normans had their eyes on riches too. They were attracted by Italy's fertile soil, its lemons, oranges, and almonds, its crafts and trade. In the year 1041, 25 years before William of Normandy invaded, a powerful Norman lord died, leaving the 12 sons. Since he had nowhere near enough land to give each son, the sons set off to seek their fortunes in Italy. I tend to pause here and ask them to imagine this situation as the sons all kind of head off over the horizon. One of them, Robert, was such a skillful military leader that he earned the name Guiscard, which meant crafty. Robert Guiscard began with no money and hardly any knights. In the Italian hills, his tiny band of followers barely survived. But crafty tricks paid off. Once Robert pretended to hold a funeral. He disguised his soldiers as mourners, hid swords in the coffin, and launched a surprise attack. Well, at this, Year 7 hit the roof. They think this is hilarious. But then Robert Guiscard was soon terrorizing towns over Italy. By 1059, he controlled much of Italy. He was so powerful that the Pope promised to support him on one condition. Robert had to fulfill one task. Robert had to capture the Muslim stronghold of Sicily. In 1072, after years of bloody struggle, Robert Guiscard succeeded. Robert now possessed large Norman kingdom, including Sicily and many Italian lands. So we're connected, right? We've got it. Normans in Italy, fine. It's not a surprise when they turn up in the First Crusade because we're expecting them. We know they're in the area, right? So this is a really nice example. It's not tricky prose. The students can read it. I found that absolutely fine. But the best thing is, at the end of the lesson, we then go back to the bullet points, and suddenly we've got a world where there are different faiths, there are different peoples, there are connections across Europe, there are different languages. So we've been upbeat. We've told a positive story about peaceful coexistence, which isn't always the case in history. And a dozen or so paragraphs I've read aloud to the class. But the magic moment is when we kneel down, right? We crouch down next to Anna's single gravestone and figure out what we can from it. And they remember this for the rest of Year 7. And I think into Year 8 as well, because this powerful, carved into stone sense of community really appeals to them. This is what they do at the end of the year. They go, Anna's gravestone. I remember Norman Sicily. And this is the anchor, their memory anchor for this particular topic. So they come back to it and then they build from that and remember as much as they can. Okay. I want to briefly talk about storytelling across different lessons. I don't think I need to linger on this for too long, but I think it's worth pointing out there are methods and techniques that will help with this. We plan our breakpoints really carefully. So we think about the beginnings. We do the TV box set thing of previously on, and we will tell you, I'll lift particular parts of the narrative back into their minds. And at the end, I'll kind of do a next time on. I'll kind of drop a little hint about what we're going to do next. Oh, yeah, 7, you're not going to believe what happens next lesson. You're never going to guess what. I'm not going to tell you now. I'm sorry. And they get, this all helps to build that sense of an ongoing story. We do focus on character as a really nice way to do this. And I think the characters are really important. So in the Alexios story, so in the story of the Byzantine Empire and the First Crusade that I just mentioned, we meet this man, Malik Shah, and you can see the text from the textbook here. Since 1071, well, the man at the center of this image is Malik Shah the First. Around him are advisors and scholars. Since 1071, Malik Shah had been a sultan, a Muslim ruler of the Seljuk Turks. Malik Shah was extremely powerful. His empire stretched thousands of miles across the Middle East and Asia Minor. Just like the Caliphs of Baghdad, Malik Shah wanted to preserve and build knowledge. From art and poetry to science and astronomy, Malik Shah was thrilled by the work of scholars. 600 miles east of Baghdad, in Isfahan. I pause that and say, yeah, I'm not very good at pronouncing that yet, so I'm sorry about that. Malik Shah built an observatory. There, his astronomers sought to unlock mathematics and physics of the universe, right? We get to meet Malik Shah. However, I've then managed to find this, which is a modern interpretation of Malik Shah from the Great Seljuks, Guardians of Justice, which is huge news on Turkish TV, if you're wondering. But I found this by Googling Malik Shah TV film, and up it pops. And they get an instant sense of who this guy is, right? As well as being the champion of scholars and the arts, he's clearly a fighter, he's clearly a warrior. From this point on, by the way, last year's Year 7s referred to big fella Malik Shah for the rest of the course. And to be honest, I don't think he'd mind. I think that, they really got a sense of who he was as someone who could project power. And for our purposes, that was really helpful. They wanted to know what he would do next. I introduced him right at the end of a lesson, and they thought, okay, this guy means business. He's going to affect our story somehow. It's wonderful. In terms of the managing that story over lessons, I tend to get them to record it on an A3 sheet. I tend them to sort of have a look at low stakes assessment and make sure that we focus that on key takeaways, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But I try and organize the information for them so they can open up an A3 sheet and they can have it all in front of them where they've got to so far with the story. And it really helps them keep focused on both the inquiry that we're looking into, but also the story as it unfolds. The comprehension questions, again, are really focused on what I want them to lift out of the story. And again, I'm just going to talk about that a bit more in a moment. But we have this sort of thinking about, and the discussion questions I've been signposting, I try to build the character, try to build the complexities, the causal elements of the stories. I try and build them into the stories as we go along, keep lifting those things to the surface. Doing it by at the starts of lessons, at the ends of lessons, to bring them back into the story is really powerful. And the experts of this are the streaming services with their box sets. You know, the kids never get the opportunity to skip the recap, but we kind of do that exact same method of, here's the story threads that you need to be reminded of before we pick up today's lesson. And it works brilliantly well. So, right, this all sounds lovely, but Dean in year 8 won't ever remember it, right? So the good news for Dean is he's not meant to, all right? And I think we all have those students where we think this isn't going to work. And we have those fears. And my department did, and I did to some extent. I thought, well, actually, is this really going to land in the way I'm hoping? And I have started talking about takeaways a little bit here. So I do want to focus in a bit more on that. When I've started talking to most people about stories, one of the things that comes up is that it seems like there's too much to remember. And I think if you try to remember all of it, then yes, it probably is too much for a year 7 to remember. It would be if I wasn't expecting them to forget most of it. I am sort of expecting them to forget a lot of it. What you'll find, though, is if you focus your teaching on the core takeaways you want them to have, then they remember the extraneous details, the marginal but memorable stuff. They remember the gravestone. The gravestone is just a vehicle into the world I want them to understand. But they remember those extra details. And I think it's almost a controversial thing to say I'm not expecting them to remember all of it, because I think we're quite trained by GCSE specifications or A-level specifications where we think, right, they could be examined on anything. We've got freedom at Key Stage 3 to decide what it is we want our students to leave classrooms with. Nobody is going to remember all of these textbooks. Very few people. Christine probably remembers every word of them because she has worked on them endlessly and they're embedded firmly in her long-term memory. But our students won't. And I think we can be totally relaxed about that because that is what the cognitive science is going to tell us. What we can do, though, is focus their attention on what we want them to remember. And the story is only the vehicle for the core learning, right? It drives the narrative, it covers the ground needed, but the core learning is embedded within it, waiting to be extracted, waiting to be mined out of it almost. So we need to figure out what that core information is and how we go about mining it, I suppose. So this is a brilliant article in Teaching History by Johnny Grand, and it is all about takeaways. This is a superb article. If you want to understand a little bit more about how we might crystallize what we're expecting students to learn in our lessons and from our curriculum, really important reading for heads of department, but also for teachers, I think. I'm going to shut up for a moment and let you read this. But this is Johnny's advice on how to, on kind of why we might want to use takeaways a little bit more. Takeaway is a very simple thing. It's a statement or two about what it is you want students to extract from a course, a unit, a whole curriculum. But we tend to focus this down at a unit level and then sometimes at a lesson level, but it tends to be around a 5 or 6 lesson inquiry. What are we wanting them to get from this particular thing? And we will do the same with a single lesson summary story like the Norman Sicily one. I want them to get a sense that Europe is connected and that there are different faiths and different people and different languages and it's diverse. Those are the main things I'm looking for with that Norman Sicily lesson. So the takeaways are really important in shaping how we treat the stuff of the stories, right? How we pick apart what it is we want them to learn. And so we have to map these things out, right? We have to think very carefully about it. It is worth taking some time to identify these takeaways. as I said, with the texts, a lot of the planning is done for you. A lot of the resourcing, quote unquote, is done for you. A lot of our students just record what they notice in their books and their jotters. And we don't actually give them out anymore, the sort of worksheets or anything. Sometimes I do a big A3 recording sheet, but that is a grid on the paper mostly. So they don't need vast amounts of extra material to learn from. Our planning, therefore, can be much more around the thinking. We identify the takeaways, we think about as a department, how the stories will fit into lessons and inquiries and wider curriculum, and what we want our students to get from them. We ask about the curricular functions of the unit. What must the students remember and what are we comfortable with them forgetting? They don't need to know the detail of the coffins and the swords from that Norman story, but I do want to get a sense that the Normans were in Sicily and it was a European thing, right? So there are bits that are, and we're happy for them to forget, but there are bits that I want them to know. I wanted them to know that there were Muslims and Jews and Christians living within the same communities. That mattered more than some of the other little details. So it allows us to kind of move faster through some sections of the story and slower through others if we know what our takeaways are going to be. It helps us sort of understand why we might need a brief introduction or a pre-teaching of a particular bit, because we're wanting to focus their attention on particular things. And we sometimes do tell them before they start to read what it is we're looking for. We remind them of what we're looking for, because again, that helps us focus our lesson and focus our learning. Now, the Boost teaching guides, by the way, that the Boost team put together, they've written these takeaways out, so you can already see them if you are short for time. The Boost doesn't cost very much at all. I mean, it's well within my budget as a head of department. So I use these, and it's a really helpful way of thinking about keeping that clear and straightforward, thinking about what you want to get from a story. And once you've done that, of course, this is a really nice way to think about how you're reading. It links back to the reading thing I was talking about earlier. This phrase, micro-curricular decisions, is what I've taken from my friend David Hibbert, because it's a really helpful idea. In the classroom, we're constantly making these small decisions about how we teach, what we emphasize, which anecdotes we tell, which images we use. And these are, in essence, micro-curricular ones. We're shaping how the curriculum lands. The students will notice what we choose to emphasize. So if we do that, they will lift the takeaways we want from these stories. And when we teach Norman Sicily, we do pause on that gravestone. So I think it is worth thinking about how you deliver them and what it is you want to get from them. And that's quite freeing, because that means sometimes you're just using stories to set a scene or to captivate the students or set some background context, but they don't necessarily need to remember the detail of it. You focus on those takeaways. All right. So how fast you read a story, what your tone is, what your emphasis is, where you place the human elements of it really helps you focus on those takeaways. Okay. So I'm going to read you a section from book 2. It's a section I wrote on Josiah Wedgwood. And I think as I read it, have a think about what takeaways is the teacher deciding to emphasize, and how am I achieving that with pace and tone and emphasis and humanity. Now, by the way, I was gonna sort of do these slides with some general images from the period, but as well as having lots of visual sources, the books do have some amazing artwork, and I was so excited when I was allowed to have some artwork commissioned for the Wedgwood story. So the last few slides are the early roughs of the artwork for that Wedgwood page. They're not the final things. The final things will look far more sort of composed and finalized. But these are the early roughs that we sent over to keep discussing what we wanted the pages to look like. They're far from finished, but they give you a really nice sense of what the book will look like. Okay, so let's have a think. Takeaways, what am I trying to emphasize, and how is the reading achieving this? This, by the way, is a question I genuinely ask. It builds curiosity and interest. They wiggle in their seat a little bit, but the anticipation, just taking a moment, pause just before we read, adds focus and interest. Okay. It's still bright. Josiah Wedgwood looks at his pocket watch. He's late. Even so, he must check all is well at Etruria. The great manufactory stands eerily quiet. The bell in the tower will not call his workforce to their throwing wheels until 6:15. In the stillness before dawn, only the lazy smoke of the bottle kilns hints at the great energy of the place. Striding past, Wedgwood feels their heat. Their coals smoulder, ready to be stoked for today's production. Overnight, in the glazing rooms, shelves of vases have dried, ready for firing. By the factory, a canal catches the moonlight. Its cavernous barges lie ready. Hearing Wedgwood's tread on the cobbled quayside, the dockmaster and bargeman work with new urgency. Wedgwood's a famously difficult master to impress. The bargemen secure crates of pottery, ready to be towed along the canal to the warehouses of Liverpool. Striding on, Wedgwood finally reaches his waiting carriage. Clambering in, he checks on a crate, packing straw poking out, strapped to the luggage rack. With a shake of the reins, the driver starts the horses. The carriage lurches away. Now, hints of dawn reveal the skyline of Wedgwood's beloved potteries. A forest of bottle kilns rises from smoky ragtag buildings. The earth beneath is ripped with clay and coal. In the kilns, coal fires bake the clay into ceramic. This landscape of mines and manufactories, of pits and pots, is vastly changed from the gentler, greener landscape of Wedgwood's youth. From his jolting carriage on mud-churned roads, he sees the canal carved straight through the craggy hills. Wedgwood envies the smooth efficiency of the deep-bellied barges. His pocket watch ticks. Will he be there on time? Wedgwood has helped shape this new landscape, but so have others. From other towns, in other rapidly changing landscapes, other men make similar journeys. Where are they headed? Why do they travel on this moonlit night? Who are they? They are all heading for the same house in Birmingham. They travel under a full moon, so their carriage drivers can see ahead. They call themselves the Lunar Society. Now the carriage reaches Stafford. Wedgwood pictures a warm fire in a smart Birmingham house. It's still 3 hours away. After changing horses, a creaking turnpike gate signals better roads. This makes Wedgwood proud. The Turnpike Trust uses money from tolls to improve this road. He helped establish it. On smoother roads, Wedgwood can read at last. Will he begin with his business papers or a scientific article about underground heat in Jamaica? Insights about heat help the master potter understand his kilns. Both can wait. He chooses a pamphlet, a sermon on the subject of the slave trade, written by a minister in the Unitarian Church. He makes him think of the crate on the luggage rack. Outside, workshops and manufactories gradually replace the hedges of enclosed Staffordshire fields. Grimy smoke replaces clear sky. The carriage rattles through the expanding outskirts of Birmingham. Hopefully, what you can notice there is I'm building him as a character, but I'm also trying to build this sense of change. There's new things. There's things he's excited to see and proud of, and that within his lifetime we've seen change. So hopefully we get a sense that this is going to be about a change inquiry. Okay, it doesn't matter if they haven't got the memory of these changes. They want a sense of the time period. And there are other signposts then as the journey reaches its conclusion about how we finish, how we set up the early modern world. At last, the crunch of gravel on a sweeping drive. It is Soho House, the grand home of Matthew Bolton, titan of manufacturing. Just as Wedgwood's potteries and roads shape the Staffordshire landscape, Bolton's industrial enterprises shape the landscape of Birmingham. There they are. Okay, sorry, I should say. We move then into the house. Footman knocks on the door, and we arrive then in the room with the Lunar Society. There they are, the Lunar Society. He knows them well. Beside the fire, Erasmus Darwin, his great friend and family doctor, is deep in conversation with John Whithurst, clockmaker and geologist. At the table, engineer James Watt and manufacturer Matthew Bolton study a model steam engine. This thunderous machine, burning mounds of coal, now brings power to mines and factories across the country. Across the room, the chemist James Keir converses with Joseph Priestley, Britain's greatest living scientist. It is Priestley who is famous for his research into gases and the new electricity. It's Priestley, minister of the largest Unitarian congregation in Birmingham, who authored the sermon which Wedgwood read on his journey. It's Priestley to whom Wedgwood most wants to speak, about the burning issue of the Africa trade. Behind him, 2 footmen carefully set down his crate. Hands are shaken, greetings exchanged. It's time to resume the work of changing the world. And so this story sets up the Wedgwood inquiry. I have some questions for them. I asked them, what have we seen so far that would have been new to these men? What changes are happening? Again, I'm focusing on those takeaways. And then I asked them to stretch their thinking. These men have what different interests and what do they have in common? And we think a little bit then about kind of how those men have sort of curiosity in common. They have faith in common. But the biggest thing they have is a desire for invention and for change and for development and for pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and understanding and technology. But I like Priestley as a character. I want them to understand that this is a blended world of people who are religious but also scientists. It's not a distinct sort of categorization thing. They should be excited, hopefully, to see the word electricity, because that's going to signify a huge change as well. So hopefully you can see here from the writing and the reading how we can sort of focus on some key takeaways. From this section, I just want them to notice there's changes in manufacturing, there's changes in transport, like the canals and the roads, and they generally do, but there's also a scientific research community going on. That's all they need from this bit. We've met some characters, we're going to meet them again. It doesn't matter that they don't remember all of it. It sets them up. And also it builds that curiosity about what change is going to happen. Okay, so we do make sure that they record and make a note of the takeaways they have, and we do make sure that we ask them questions around what they read, and we keep that assessment focused on those takeaways, and that really helps. So hopefully, yeah, that gives you a sense of how we're using these in the classroom in some more granular detail. We're using them for single lessons. We're using to stitch stories together in between lessons when we're teaching over a time period of several lessons. And we try and focus on the takeaways. We try and do that through our reading, but also through our things that go on around the story. So the starter tasks, the plenary tasks, and so on. There's lots more, as Christine said at the start, where this comes from. You know, these books are full of these stories, and you can choose the ones you want to use, and you can start building up, as we're doing, to using more and more of them in a given year. Oh, let's move on here. So many more to come. These are some little snapshots of book 2. You can see here some lovely chapter opening pages of book 2 and how they're starting to tell those stories in different ways. I won't linger on this slide because we are a little short of time. But here again is the information about the webinars so far. If you found this interesting, you want to know more, there's other webinars here that might help you. Okay, we are coming to the end of the initial presentation section then. But what we're going to do instead is we are going to offer to answer questions in the chat box. I'm very happy for any questions to come in now, and I'll start to answer them. Equally, if you're happy with what you've seen and that's you done for the day, that's absolutely fine as well. We'll answer any questions you've got. We're not in any rush to leave, as it were. So if you have got questions, by all means, pop them in. Otherwise, yeah, that is the end of the presentation section of the webinar. And I'm happy now to answer questions, and Christine will chip in with some answers as well.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely comments. Thank you, Hugh. That was terrific. So great. It's wonderful to have Hugh on the team with wonderful writing. But as you can see, gosh, the experience and the skill that oozes through there from all that Hugh knows how to do. And I can vouch for the fact that Hugh is doing this with the full attainment range. You know, plenty of children with different kinds of special needs are all able to access history through this richness of narrative.
We have got a first question here. Do the students have the text in front of them as you're reading, or do they listen? No, they have the text in front of them pretty much all of the time. Occasionally, I keep the books closed and I'll read an opening, and I ask them to close their eyes and totally imagine it. For EAL students, it's a really good question, and I think one of the major things with acquiring a second language and becoming more multilingual is exposure to language. This does this in 2 ways. There's lots of modeling, and there's lots of them listening to people read as they read along. That really helps them build their phonics awareness as well, and that kind of learning of the new language. But I would say, similar to what I was saying about sort of the SCND students, where I will then start to encourage them to read a sentence. I might highlight it for them on a photocopied piece of paper and say, I'd like you to have a go at reading this. And you can sort of start building just little tiny fragments of reading for them to do. And again, as they build their confidence, as the year goes on, as their time in the country continues. We have quite a few refugee children here at the moment, and we're doing this with them, and they love being part of it. They love listening to their peers read, but they really do like it. They like the choral practice of vocabulary. So all of those things that I've talked about really does benefit them as well.
Oh, there's a question there from Mark about any chance of a chapter outline of the next. we have put out a chapter outline of the Year 8 book, and we could probably give you a chapter outline of the Year 9 book if you're interested.
Where will we put them out, Christine? How are we going to get those to people?
I think we'd have to have a conversation with our publisher, wouldn't we?
Okay. Yeah, we might be able to do it with the recording link for this one, maybe.
Yeah, and we could certainly do it in the next webinar, but certainly we've you know, the book 9, Year 9, book 3. I always get them muddled up. The book 3, which is for Year 9, is fully planned, and the authors are working away on the chapters, which is very, very exciting. So the plan might change a bit, but we could certainly give an indication of the topics and everything that we're covering. And it's very similar to book 1 and 2 in the sense that it's even more global, as you'd perhaps expect for Year 9 than books 1 and 2, but still with that strong British spine woven through it nonetheless. And I love what you said about choral response, Hugh. I work a lot with primary schools, and we do a huge amount of that when we first introduce new words. And we tend to have a lot of fun with those words, especially if they're going to crop up in a text. And then the children are quite excited to see how they're going to crop up. And we do heaps of choral response. And I've never found Year 7, 8, and 9 found that too babyish. I think they love it. You know, they're using choral response when they're learning languages, and you can have a lot of kind of quite grown-up, witty fun with it, and sort of saying them in silly voices and whatnot. But every single child pronouncing the words, wrapping their lips and tongues around it, saying it several times, just makes such a difference for their readiness to encounter the word in the text.
Yeah, and I had a conversation, as I say, about transubstantiation with Year 12, and they were struggling to pronounce it, and they were kind of shying away from pronouncing it. And I went, right, we're stopping this, and we're going to actually say this word, and we're going to, because let's just sound it out. And they were absolutely fine with that. They really didn't mind that at all. They did find it quite funny. They did have to take 2 or 3 attempts at it because they were giggling, but they didn't mind it. They were absolutely fine to learn it, and it actually meant that who didn't know it and who did know it was lost within the choral, and that's really important.